This video is all about CSS selectors. At the end of this lesson, you will be able to demonstrate the use of CSS selectors to style markup. So let's learn all about CSS selectors. Remember that CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. Markup is the foundation of our websites, and CSS would be the style or the flavor, the attitude of your websites. So if markup is the layout or the structure of your building, then CSS would be the paint, the fixtures, the color of the brick, and things like that that make the building pop. There are different types of selectors that we use to gain access to our markup. There are universal style selectors, element selectors, IDs, and classes. Knowing their differences is crucial to building amazing user interfaces. So let's figure out exactly what selectors are, what it is that we're talking about here. They are used to gain access to an HTML tag. Each selector type carry what are known as specificity weights, and these can be used to layer on many different styles. Selector weights have a major impact on how we build our apps and web pages, so it's really important to understand them. But let's first cover the universal selector, or otherwise known as the wildcard or star. This star would be able to select all of the properties, all of the items in our page. This will select every single element on a page. It's also known as the wildcard or star selector. Its specificity weight is less specific than any other. So if you're using the star element or the wildcard element to select your all of the content, it could be easily overridden. Let's look at element selectors. We have this h1 tag, lambda is fun. We could style that h1 tag by saying h1 gets the color of blue. This is used for styling all elements with that same tag. So all h1s will have the same color of blue. We're basically saying, hey browser, find all h1s, give them the color blue. The specificity weight of element selectors are more specific than universal, but less specific than all others. So they too are also easily overwritten. Class selectors. What is the .class? Notice that these h1s and divs have a class of example class or another class. We could then style them by writing example class, and all the example classes would get the color green, font size 16 rems, and text align center. This introduces a heavier specificity than universal and element selectors. It allows us to select HTML elements by placing special attributes on them. Also, the same class can be used over and over again. So in our example here, we're using example class on multiple h1s. That h1 will be styled specifically with these particular styles. Any other h1s with different classes will get different styles. It allows designers and developers to be more specific. So this is the idea of the communication between a designer and developer. That social contract that you have between your developer and your designer is sort of built around this idea of being able to select elements and style them in this way. Classes are probably the most commonly used way of styling items on your web page. The specificity weight of classes is more than universal and element, but less than ID and important, which we're going to go over. So we can have multiple classes. That's one thing that's really, really important to understand here. We could have a h1 whose class is A, B, C, and D. Okay? It has 4 classes, and we can also style just the A, give it the color green. HTML elements can have multiple classes assigned, so you can add as many of these classes as you'd like to tweak your individual elements. That allows for layers of specificity and order that we can control by adding on sibling classes. So you can simply control things a little bit more by adding classes to your elements. The specificity weight, and the rule here is the lowest class on the page wins. Okay, so if A had the color green and D had the color of blue, blue would win. Okay, so we also, with classes, we get this thing called pseudo classes. So if we had all of these normal H1s, and then we wanted to select just the last child on our page, we could do that by saying H1 colon last child, or in our case, H1 is the pseudo class found here. That last element on this page is the last element within that scope. So the last one gets the color orange while the other two are unaffected. So this is really useful when a set amount of elements is unknown. Pseudo classes are used all the time, by the way. An example of this is a list of items in a store inventory. The list is variable. It grows and shrinks every day with purchases. Imagine that the last item in the inventory needed to be styled a different color. Without pseudo classes, we wouldn't be able to achieve this result. Specificity weight of pseudo classes are more than specific universal element and classes in general, but less specific than ID, inline styles, and of course, important. Okay, let's talk about ID selectors, the hashtag. Here we have an H1 with an ID of example ID. We can select that H1 by using the hash symbol by saying the example ID needs to be color gold. These are used only once per page, so there's only one ID assigned to one element. Cannot have multiple reusable IDs. Used for very specific reasons that cannot be accomplished by simply using classes. Also, they're heavily used in libraries like jQuery. Anytime you're selecting items with JavaScript and the documents object model, the DOM, it's better to use classes because sometimes you want to just simply interpret and select that one single thing. Sometimes you want to select all the classes on the screen, but ID gives you a little bit more specific use. The specificity weight of classes is that they will trump everything we've learned about so far. So more than classes, pseudoclasses, universal, and element selectors. But they will also be less than inline and important styles. So, some things to consider here before we dive into this next section is that these next particular items go beyond the normal specificity rules. Not knowing how and when to use them can make things difficult. So know how and when to use them. Avoid their use for everyday styling. And they do have a place in the CSS ecosystem, but you need to be mindful when using them. Sometimes mindfulness is as simple as saying, I know that I'm using inline styles or important right now. Maybe I shouldn't be doing this. That's mindfulness. Okay? So there's 3 different style integrations that we can use before we talk about these heavyweights. Inline styles, embedded styles, like embedded style tags in an HTML page, or externally linked CSS files. We will be focusing on the externally linked style tags. This gives us more control. Learn all 3, so when you see them, you know when to use them. That's our idea here. So let's talk first about the first one, inline styles. Inline styles are simply put styles that you can add as an attribute to an element like this H1 whose style attribute is the color of red. Imagine if you had to write all your styles like this inline. It would suck really bad. But now we actually use a style attribute. This can be very useful within many JavaScript libraries, but is to be avoided elsewhere. So in early days of like React.js, for example, we did inline styles a lot because there was no good practice for determining how best to style our elements. Specificity weight here is more than everything except for $important. So this is the top of the totem pole in terms of weight. Okay. Now, embedded styles are a lot like inline styles. However, we just use a style tag instead inside of our document. We could take that style tag and we could use this style tag to make this flow a little bit better. Because developers outgrew inline styles pretty quickly, so a style tag was introduced to the HTML spec. So we can use that in an HTML document and we can write our styles right there in line. So it will house everything that external style sheets house, but does it in the same document. So the way we're going to learn, the way we're going to develop is going to be externally linking our style sheets, but you can use these types of style tags inside your document to style your elements as well. The specificity weight of embedded styles are, of course, more than universal element pseudoclasses and IDs, but less than inline styles and less than important. Some benefits to embedded styles. There's no external HTTP request for fetching externally linked style sheets. Every single time you link up a style sheet, your browser has to make a request to go and find that style sheet and load it into your document. It's a little bit heavy. It can get a little bit heavy. So embedding is actually really performant. You know exactly what is on the page and you don't have to go out of your way to look around at extra files to find these styles that you've been writing. External style sheets are seen as content blocking by some search engines. You could lose out on SEO rank as a result, which is kind of a bummer. So some of the drawbacks to embedded styles are tightly coupled and they get in the way of reusability. Remember, this is the idea of taking in that style tag, writing all of your styles inside of your HTML document. So imagine a giant HTML document that is just full of all these styles. External style sheets are overwritten by any embedded style tags with duplicate selectors. So imagine if you had a bunch of duplicate selectors that you're expecting your styles to come through, they'll be overwritten as soon as you embed. If you buy into this approach, you have to own it and stick with it. Here at Lambda School, we will be using externally linked style sheets. Okay, so let's learn about those. Externally linked style sheets are styles that are linked up with the link tag in an HTML document. The rules for this are a link tag is required to pull in styles for any external resources or file. 100% of CSS is written in .css or .scss files, things like that. Easier to identify and reuse. Specificity is controlled in one place. There's never any tampering with inline or embedded styles. And of course, the specificity weight is less than inline, embedded, and important. So the important tag should be seldomly used. That's for when we want to override everything. This is saying, no matter what, I want this element to be this thing. We're saying don't do this. It's the most heavy of them all. It's the hardest to overwrite. You can't override it, really. This style property has the most weight of them all. It will override any other styles assigned to that element. Avoid using it unless you must. You will know when you must. The only time I think it is okay is when a third-party library is overriding what you want, and you have to trump them all. For example, when you're using something like Bootstrap. So now let's actually dive in and let's learn about these specificity weights by writing some code. So go ahead and open up codepen.io, open up a new CodePen, and meet me over there. Okay, so notice that we have this little HTML document with a div wrapping a header, wrapping an H1, wrapping a nav with some navigation anchor tag links. Notice how nicely indented everything is. I can't stress the importance of indentation more. It's very important you follow these practices. The idea here is that we are going to learn about specificity weights by following along with the tutorial found in Training Kit. So if you go over to Training Kit and copy and paste that div that's found there under the selectors tutorial, we're going to be able to get some practice writing our CSS selectors by using this HTML as a starting point. So we can actually write these things in our CSS file right here in line. Okay. So if we wanted to style everything in our HTML to have a font size of 16 pixels, we could use the universal selector. So let's go ahead and do that now. So I'm going to universally select everything and say font size of 16 pixels. If I go ahead and save that and run it, you'll notice that everything changed. We have everything overwritten to the 16 pixels. So now we're going to use an element selector. So go ahead and select that anchor tag and let's change it up a little bit because remember, element selectors are going to override the universal selector. So I'm just going to write comments here as we go about, and then I'll save this so you have a copy of this to use. So I'm just going to do this up here. Universal wildcard selector, least specific, least, like a car leased. It's funny. You should laugh. Okay, and then I'm also going to say element selector will override universal. Okay, now let's say the text decoration on this anchor tag is going to be none, meaning I don't want any of the default blue underscore, that stuff's just ugly. Let's go ahead and save that and run it. And notice that our lines underneath went away. Okay? So now let's add some classes. So the first thing that we want to do, we have container, we have main header, that's it for classes. So let's go ahead and add some classes here. So let's style by main header. Remember, all classes are selected with a period. If I could type today, that would be awesome. And I'm going to just do a font size of 24 pixels. Okay. And I'm also going to do a color of crimson. So what is this going to do? This is going to find our H1. It's going to select the class who has a font size of 16, but we're going to override that font size. Okay. So we're going to override it, and we're also going to change it to a bright red color, crimson. See what happens when we save and refresh. It's taking a minute to rerun. Main header is what I'm looking for here. I'm sorry. That is totally my bad. It's not taking a minute. It just was a typo. Okay, so Lambda School is now crimson red, and it's 24 pixels big. Fantastic. So this, we're going to change the text here and say that class selector will override universal and also element selectors. Okay? All right. The next thing we want to do is style our nav item. So there's some styles there found in Training Kit. I want you to actually type these out, however, as opposed to copy and paste them. Get used to writing your code like this. Padding. We're going to say 5 pixels on the top and bottom. And then we're going to say 20 pixels on the left and right. Okay, so that's shorthand for saying top and bottom of our nav items get 5 pixels of padding, and then left and right get 20 pixels. So on the left side and the right side, and then on the top and bottom, 5 pixels and 20 pixels, so to speak. Our background for our nav items are going to be, and we don't have nav item class selected, but we'll get there. Our background is going to be a light gray. Our border is going to be 1 pixel. This is some shorthand here. We're going to say solid that border and make it gray as well. And then we're going to say margin. We're going to give this a margin of 10 pixels on the top, bottom, left, and right. Then we're going to say border radius of 5 pixels to kind of round out the borders. And we're also going to say display an inline block. Should remember inline block or inline. We're going to learn all about those properties tomorrow. And then of course we want the text color to be black. Okay, so now that we have this little style here, if we run this, nothing should change because we don't have a nav item added to our links here. So if this is a nav item, this is our navigation, these are nav items, we're going to style these elements to be nav items. So I'm just going to put a class of nav item on our first one, and we'll see what the styles look like. Nice, little navigation there. So let's do the same thing on the rest of our anchor tags here. Save that and run it. And notice that we have a nice little user-friendly anchor tag. If you wanted to take this a little bonus step further, you could use a pseudo selector like hover. And you could say on hover, we want the background to go to a different type of gray. And as I hover, You can see that kind of looks nice, like little clickable links, little buttons. So that's a pseudo selector of hover, and it's kind of like last child. It's just in that same family of last child that we learned about from the slides earlier. So I just wanted to throw that in there. It's not a part of your training kit, but you can look at all the different types of pseudo selectors in MDN. Highly recommend you doing that after this video. But notice that we have this ID here. So remember, class selectors are going to override universal and element. Element's going to override universal, and universal will be the least on the totem pole. Okay? Now we're going to do what's called an ID selector. We'll override element, or let's do it in order, class, element, and universal. So you always remember. So now we have an ID, we're going to call it apply. And apply is going to select that last item that has the ID, and we're going to say the background gets hashtag 125127. So that last link is going to look a little bit different than the other links on our navigation system. If I go ahead and run that, ooh, it's a nice green background. And notice the problem here. Hover is actually gone away because hover is on the class. We're not actually getting that hover effect. Okay, so that's important to distinguish. So when we select IDs, we use the hash. When we select classes, we use the period. IDs will trump everything that we've learned up until this point. Okay? So now what I want you to do is I want you to look into the other two different types of selectors. And potentially, let's try something new really quick. Let's say that apply is applying that background of that ugly forest green. And let's select apply again. And let's say that we just had, for some reason, written our background to be, let's say, pale violet red. Now, this would automatically override the idea here. Because of cascading, the way that our styles cascade, this was written last. But what happens if I add that important tag? Okay, now this is just for learning purposes. Notice that important, even though our styles cascaded down to apply, this last written apply, important overwrote that pale violet red. So it is important to understand that this is the top of the totem pole. This is the most important thing on the totem pole. This will get the most specificity weight. Okay? So it should be used very, very sparingly, especially if imagine a CSS file that has thousands and thousands of different selectors. Okay? So I wanted you to be aware of that and also understand the principle that the last thing wins. These styles cascade, but that also means that the last thing defined will get the item on the totem pole. Okay? So there is a selector challenge found in Training Kit just under what we just did that will help you push your skills beyond what we have learned here today. You have just digested a lot of information. The only way to get better at it is to just continue to practice. So go ahead and dive into Training Kit and find that challenge and complete it and get yourself prepared for the lecture tomorrow. Thank you for tuning in.